Hey y'all, how are y'all? Doing pretty good myself. Was going to start this Bible series about the book of Matthew, and I really would like us to gain some insight on how and why Matthew is, a key ingredient to the gospel and stuff. And I think it was a pretty good launching point to start off with. But man, I hope everybody's well. I hope everybody's doing great. I'm shooting from my kitchen. Everybody is kind of either asleep or I think Lynette had to go and take care of a couple things at school, had a meeting or so. But man, I'm glad you're with us right quick and stuff. And this is a kind of going to be a weekly thing. I'm going to give some do some production type Bible studies and stuff on the book of Matthew, and it's going to go on my YouTube link in my page and stuff. And hey, everybody got a third shot over there and stuff. But anyway, I think I think that Matthew is a good launching point, because Matthew, kind of a little bit of background. Matthew was really a not liked person, and I'll share this story with you. When I was in elementary school, we had this thing called the safety patrol, man, and they had they monitored the halls. They were students that were selected by the teachers, and it was called safety patrol. So they had this nice little bandolier and this little badge, and they stood in certain places in the hallway, and man, I was like, oh, I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that. And so I had a friend of mine that became one of those safety patrol officers or whatever, and I was like, man, I'd love to become a safety patrol officer, but I never get picked or anything like that. And he said, you don't want it. And I said, why? He said, because I am probably the most hated person in school, and just his position of authority, he pretty much had to write people's names out that were running in the hallway or this, that, and the other and stuff, and had to turn that in. And Matthew was placed in that kind of position of kind of a power afforded to him by the Roman government. He collected taxes for the Roman government, and when he collects that taxes, he usually charges a little bit, what they call like a surcharge, his price. No one else knew what the Romans charged as far as taxes, but the tax collector. So you could pretty much mess with the numbers there and make a pretty profitable living. And Matthew was one of those people, and so he was not well liked among his countrymen. So anyway, so Matthew. Pretty much was a not a very well liked person in Jewish society, because he was, not only was he a Jew, but he was a Jew that's kind of sold out to the Roman government to kind of betray his Jewish countrymen in collecting taxes. So Matthew was not very well liked, and for someone to afford him compassion and mercy and grace and stuff like that, he was probably looked, even by the disciples before Matthew was called, was looked at like, Jesus, man, what are you doing calling this tax collector? He's betrayed his own countrymen. I'm sure that probably floated through the ranks there among the disciples, and but Jesus saw compassion on Matthew and called him to follow him. So when Matthew's gospel is started out, when we look at the gospel message, there's certain elements we have to look at that bring a purpose in each gospel. And so we have to look at the audience. We have to look at different the social structure of who they were communicating the gospel to. And so Matthew is probably one of the most Jewish written gospels. I mean, Jewish centrally focused among the gospels. And so he wrote that gospel with a purpose, and when we start off Matthew in Matthew's gospel, it gives a lineage of who Jesus is, to establish that prophetic gospel with the people he's communicating. And if you look at the people that Matthew was communicating to, was the Jewish people, and so they had a lot to validate for the proclaiming of Jesus as the coming Messiah. So when we look in Matthew's first part, we see that we are expressing his family lineage through the gospel. So man, I tell you, we're family. So a lot of times, I mean, do you really know where your family came from? Where, have you ever sat down with an older parent or something like that, or a relative, and connected your relatives to a certain place or a certain time, or what have you? My family came from Germany, so a lot of my family heritage came from Germany into America, and this, that, and the other. So that's what basically Matthew was trying to establish to the Jewish people, that about where Jesus came from and how he fits into the prophecies that were foretold in the Old Testament. See, the Jewish people at that time had the only thing they had to look to is the Old Testament. Because the New Testament hasn't been written, and the New Testament is just saturated with Old Testament prophecies and Old Testament, how can I put this? Old Testament purposes and plans that God's had for the people of Israel. That the New Testament is so saturated with that. Paul used it. Jesus used the Old Testament to make his case, make his claim that we are God's chosen people, and that God is provision to everybody. So Matthew had to establish that case, and so that's the reason why in the first part of Matthew, in Matthew 1, that we get those timelines established and such, and some pretty interesting stuff. So he had to convince the people that he was communicating to the gospel, the people that he was communicating the gospel of Jesus to. He had to convince the Jewish people. So his focus point was the Jewish people. But you know what? When it's all said and done, even though Matthew wrote the gospel, Matthew experienced the compassion and the love and the grace and the mercy from Jesus. Like I said, Matthew was not the most liked person in society. He had a job that was not only difficult to do, but not very popular to do, and such. And so, man, when Jesus called him, guess what? Man, he closed up shop and he followed Jesus. A lot of the disciples pretty much dropped everything they did to go follow Jesus. And you'll find that through the gospel, that not only Matthew's gospel, but also the other synoptic gospels that they just, all the disciples give up everything they had to go follow this man named Jesus. And so my wife and I are going through the series. It's on PureFlix. It's called The Chosen, and it is, let me say it right off the bat, it's the gospel, but it's not. When we look at The Chosen, it is those central people and their backstories of how they come to know Christ. Now, it's not a it's the gospel, but it's a gospel played out, and the encounters that Jesus have with certain people in the gospel, it really just kind of brings a lot to it. And the one that stuck out to me was, of course, Mathew and such. And if you really want to get an illustration on how bad Mathew was treated as a tax collector, just give it a watch. Give the very first episode a watch, and it's really neat to see these characters come alive. My wife and Spencer and all of us, it was kind of a game. We were trying to before. I mean, the disciples weren't just introduced into the movie like subtitles like "This is John." It wasn't. You pretty much had to say, and before they mentioned their name, had to go, "I think that's Simon." Well, it has to be Simon and Andrew, and then it came out to be quite fun and such. And one neat part about it was that John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a weird guy, was an odd guy, and he ate locusts, and he lived in the desert, but he prophesied these whole things. And one of the disciples had talked about so I hear it, Creepy John is in prison. And when you said Creepy John, you kind of really knew that it was John the Baptist. And I thought that was so funny that John the Baptist, that they had, and even though we read the Gospels and stuff and see the amazing events that happen in Jesus' life, we fail to understand that, in between those Gospels, that life happened. Life continued on. The funny, the seriousness, the sadness, the joy continued on in between those miraculous events. And this movie, The Chosen, it really shows a funny side of Jesus, and the very serious purpose mission that Jesus had. And like I said, if you really want to get a really good grip of how bad Mathew was not liked, give it a read. I mean, look, he was walking down the street and somebody spat on him. I mean, it was he had a guard appointed by Quintus to escort him through the city. He even paid people to kind of smuggle him into work. It's just really a funny way to kind of, not a funny way, but gives a very, very insightful way to view the Gospels and see these characters and see all the struggles they went through. And then when they meet Jesus, oh my goodness. And last night's episode was when Mathew was kind of in the shadows watching the disciples and Jesus, and he had that almost revelation at times. And then all of a sudden Jesus walks by and tells him, "Follow me," and he closes up his shop, locks everything, and goes follow Jesus. I mean, it was just an awesome time. So if you get a chance, watch that. I mean, it really gets the thing. But anyway, let's get back to the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew has some pretty interesting things about it. That is the first gospel that ever mentions the church or other believers outside of Jewish belief. That it mentions the telling of the gospel to everyone, not just the Jews or anything like that. It tells the expansion of the gospel to the world, to Gentiles, to you and I, that are not Jewish. So, man, it has some really forward thinking in it. But it is a kind of a history book on how to connect Jesus with the prophesied Old Testament of his coming to who the Jewish people that time were looking at, and Jesus. So, man, I hope you really check that out. But anyway, hey, I'm gonna be doing some of these. We're gonna be diving. This is kind of the intro kind of version for my YouTube channel and stuff. So if you like it, click the link on the below and stuff. And if you give it a thumbs up or what have you, and this will be kind of a closed thing, but if you want to share it, that's perfectly fine and stuff. So anyway, hope everybody's well. Hope everybody. Hope I get to see you soon. And such like that. But it's been kind of an interesting 8 weeks or so. But anyway, I appreciate it. Thank you. We love you. We're praying for you. We're still on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I don't do the Snapchat thing. I'm not sure how to do that, but we're on the top 3 or so. But anyway, just give us a holler, give us a check. Like I said, subscribe, like, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye. Love y'all.